Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lucy Shuker. I've come from Queen Mary University of London. It's going to be a slightly different presentation. I'm not an engineer. I come from an environmental science background. I was very lucky to be able to just finish my PhD with Mayesbrook Park as my main case study. So I had a really good insight into the whole project. It was an interdisciplinary study, so I was looking at the biophysical changes in rivers when they go through this kind of restoration. But I was also looking at the partnership and how it came together. So that was why I was asked today to stand in for Robert Oates, who couldn't be here, who's the director of the Thames Rivers Restoration Trust. Okay, so first of all, just to explain what the Thames Rivers Restoration Trust do. They're a non-governmental organisation. They're working to improve the River Thames and its tributaries across the River Basin, the River Thames Basin District. And they work in partnership with public and private organisations across a broad sector of different types of organisation. So, as typical of all the river trusts, they take an ecosystems approach. They're really interested in sustainable development, so they're looking at not only the environmental sustainability of projects, but also social well-being and the economic aspects. And really what I'm interested in is that central part of the diagram, these integrated approaches, which is what I found so interesting about the river restoration that I was able to observe at Mayesbrook. So a little bit of background. Apologies for all those in the audience who know quite a bit about the drivers for river restoration currently. The EU Water Framework Directive has been really big news for people who are involved in river science. Basically, it's a legal directive. It was introduced in 2000, transposed into UK law in 2003 through the regulations. It is a framework, so it sets very broad requirements, and the details of who actually delivers that has been decided by individual member states. The most important thing about the directive is that it requires each member state to deliver the requirements in Water Framework Directive via these river basin management plans, and it's going to supersede a lot of other directives, so it's bringing together lots of different of ambitions, and it's bringing it together in a new way, looking at the ecological potential of water bodies that are heavily modified, which is what we're considering today in these urbanised catchments. If you've got a river body that's not modified, then we're looking at good ecological status, but for heavily modified water bodies, this obviously just isn't going to be possible in most cases. So just very quickly, the primary purpose of WFD is to prevent deterioration, protect and enhance the status of aquatic ecosystems, promote sustainable water use, reduce those polluting discharges, which inevitably are going to come in diffuse and point sources, and to contribute to mitigating the effects of drought and floods, which is obviously what we're all interested in today. Very, very quickly, obviously it comes from the bottom up. We're interested in improving water quality, not allowing that to deteriorate. We want to aim towards the top of the diagram, those ecological indicators, but to support those we want to make sure that there's good morphology in river systems, and also that the hydrology is sufficient to support the ecological elements, and also for people as well. But it's environmental flow is very important. Overall, the directive states, that it wants to be a dialogue that's promoting integration of policy areas, and I think that's really interesting that it's bringing all these different elements together. Thames Rivers Restoration Trust cover projects across the river basin, the Thames River Basin District. There are several projects that they're involved in. The Mayesbrook project over here in East London is the biggest restoration project that they've been involved in, and it's also a pilot project for the London Rivers Action Plan. Thinking back to 3 years ago when the project started, and I started investigating it, there were several different drivers that were really important alongside the Water Framework Directive. Making Space for Water from DEFRA was out in 2004, and that was obviously talking about, holding back water in areas where we could. Great if you've got a catchment scale approach and you've got a rural catchment, keeping it up in the headwaters, but in an urban catchment, maybe we have to look at other opportunities. Getting closer to the area of the Mayesbrook, it's actually a tributary of the River Roding, and that's why this has been mentioned in this list. Basically, their catchment flood management plan stated that climate change is going to mean we need to adapt the existing defences over time rather than replacing them like for like. We will be seeking a different combination: flood storage, river defences and floodplain attenuation. So the ground was set for something different in that catchment. The London Catchment Change Adaptation Strategy, very interested and focused on urban greening, of course. London's Rivers Action Plan, I've mentioned again, that came into action at the end of 2008, 2009. And also GLA Environment Committee inquiry was around the same time, and TRRT were involved in several of these drivers. A little bit of background about Mayesbrook Park itself. It's about 48 hectares, situated in the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. It's a pretty big park, although if you have never been to Barking and Dagenham, you may never have heard of it, until recently maybe, when it's been getting a lot more coverage. The park itself is pretty bleak, and you can see along the left of the actual demarked area there, the Mayesbrook itself runs right along the border of the park. The park was designated as a public area of amenity in around the 1930s when the surrounding housing was developed. And at that time, the channel had already been straightened. We look back on maps dating back to the 1800s, you can see that the channel hadn't changed that much over that time. But what had happened when the park was established was that it was put into a resection channel which was concrete lined. So it was pretty dismal. And the saddest thing of all is that it's actually sitting behind a fence, so nobody could even see it. And after years of dredging, and the dredging has been dumped on the side of the river just behind where that fence is, it had actually formed an embankment. So the irony is, you've got a river, you've got a park, which would be its natural floodplain. When heavy rainfall comes, and there's a flood management system, which I'll explain in a minute, there was actually an increased risk of flooding to neighbouring properties due to the embankment. So flows were not being channelled into that lovely big open space. One of the problems with the park was it was a very bleak and featureless area. This is just looking at one little corner of it. There were a lot of problems with vandalism and social issues in the area. It's one of the top 20 deprived areas in the country, I believe. And so there were an awful lot of issues going on in the area. So it was an area that the partners were particularly interested in getting involved in for development, because there were a great deal of opportunities there. Looking up at the other end of the catchment, you can see that the river channel is very heavily modified. So it was a heavily modified water body, so we weren't going to be looking at anything other than good ecological potential in this case. Also in the catchment, water quality issues, as there are in very many London catchments, which we haven't really touched upon very much today. Although Thames Water weren't actually one of the steering group partners, they were really heavily involved within the catchment through their misconnections project, which had been ongoing for a number of years before the project came into being. This is actually part of the National Connect Right campaign, which involves a list of partners shown here. So there were issues which needed addressing. As part of the monitoring, the baseline and the ongoing monitoring, Queen Mary had been involved in doing water and sediment quality analysis. So it's an issue which was also one of the drivers for the project, that they really hope it's something that's going to be addressed through the restoration, not least by actually restoring the water course and creating areas of wetland with the potential to actually filter out some of this pollution, but also by raising awareness in the local community, which I think is really fundamental. At the end of the day, misconnections are coming from local people, so they need to be aware of these issues. It's a contentious one, so it's one that we'll see in the future more of, no doubt. In terms of the flood management infrastructure that was operating in the park, if I just go back up to the map, right, the lakes form part of the flood management system that had been in operation for roughly 50 years or so. The channel coming down the side of the park, there's the sluice gate, which is in the image I just showed you a minute ago. And what happens when tidal levels are high and there's high pluvial rain, high pluvial input in the catchment. When the rainfall's heavy, the sluice gates goes down and the water gets channeled into the lakes. That's the system that was supposed to be in operation. What they were hoping to do, instead of replacing some of this infrastructure that was pretty out of date, they were looking for some more natural systems. Solutions to the problem. So a feasibility in 2008 highlighted that this historic flood infrastructure was actually getting pretty dated. It was designed to cope with, last century flood levels. It wasn't designed to deal with these sort of the peak rainfall that's associated with the climate change projections in the planning guidance currently. Also, that historic channel engineering was increasing the conveyance, and that embankment was increasing the risk to neighbouring properties. So that this potential to actually use that area within the park was highlighted. And the Environment Agency were very keen to sort of look at some alternative methods in line with the DEFRA guidance as well. And the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham were very keen to look into the possibility of taking a different approach, working with nature instead of working against it. So the partners commissioned a master plan, and they were very interested in also looking at it in terms of how it might be, good in the sense of dealing with these extra pressures associated with climate change, as I've mentioned already, the flood defence issues, but also looking at more wider objectives, thinking about natural resilience, the habitats that could be created for wildlife and for the human communities living nearby. They were also interested in combating the heat island effect and thinking about what the implications would be for maintenance and less intense regimes in that part of the park potentially. The objectives that the partners really brought together were to obviously meet the restoration standards in line with WFD, and also for the London Rivers Action Plan, to use the floodplain as storage for additional rainfall, but also to create an area that would be appealing for recreation, a landscape that would be inspiring to people, with opportunities for natural play and green gyms and that sort of thing. They wanted it to be, a real sustainable asset, because there were lots of problems. There are lots of problems in the area, and they were looking for more engagement opportunities. And through the partnership, which actually in the end went up to 10 partners in total, they wanted to show how a partnership of that size could actually work effectively together, bring in lots of diverse sources of funding, and really achieve something innovative. In the end, what they were interested in demonstrating was the fact that, if one organisation tries to do something on its own, the cost might be completely, off the mark. But if it's in a partnership context, actually you're getting much better value for money, something of a bargain. In terms of phase one, the project became split into two phases, because an opportunity to have money from a development adjacent to the site was held up within the bureaucracy of planning. And so what happened in the end was that the partnership had to pull in lots of different sources of funding and to split the project into two phases. So phase one came in at 1.4 million. They had a considerable amount from the Mayor of London, from the Help London Park project. RSA, the insurance company, contributed 300,000 because they were interested in demonstrating different approaches to flood management to be part of the solution. Natural England put in a considerable amount alongside the CETA Trust, or landfill tax, that kind of thing, Environment Agency, Barking and Dagenham, and the list goes on. Oh, significantly at the bottom you notice the Olympic Development Agency also contributed 120,000 for specifically for SUDS, which were associated with the development of an athletics training facility, which is also becoming part of the Olympics legacy within Mayesbrook Park. In terms of phase two, there are a lot more things being planned for the lakes. As I'm running out of time, I shall speed through, but basically, with many partners and many different ideas of what they could do in the park, they were able to pull in all sorts of different funding sources, and hopefully we'll be demonstrating multiple benefits. RSA got involved because they wanted to demonstrate some positive solutions to natural flood management. There's more information about that on their website. They wanted to get their people involved in actually doing volunteering on the site. As I mentioned, it had a climate change objective about it, so there's a whole list of things there which I won't go into, because I'm sure what you're much more interested in is actually seeing some images of what happened. There was a great deal of consultation that went on over time. Work started in March 2011, endorsed by representatives of the various partners, plus Richard Benyon, who apparently is on the digger. Hard to recognise him up there. So just to do a quick overview of the transformation that's taken place within the park. In Reach 1 in March, there was a transformation by September to something which is a lot more naturalised, no more concrete. It's going to be planted up with it has been planted up with wildflower seeds, and there's going to be reeds planted around the top of where the water is coming in from a culvert, because there are obviously issues with bits of litter, so they want to make it easy to manage up at that end. Reach 2, before restoration, behind the fence, now looks like this. The bank had been regraded. It was the most constrained section of the park, so they were limited by an EDF cable which went underground, so they couldn't actually reroute the channel, so they did the best they could, and they took away the fence and put in a nice low rail. In this reach, they were also able to put in the SUDS ponds, which I mentioned, which were associated with that Olympic development. Down in Reach 3, which I showed you before, is the biggest area of transformation. They've created a sinuous channel in line with the expectations for WFD. There's pools and riffles there, there are backwaters, there are areas of wetland. It's very raw in this picture. It still looks fairly bare at the moment, but there is planting that's due to be going on in the next few months, so I'm hoping in the next couple of years it's going to start greening up considerably. In this reach, there's a permanent SUDS pond, which is going to be a wetland area, and that should be permanently wet. Reach 4 was another constrained area, but they've still managed to do quite a bit of work regrading and creating some sinuosity in the channel. So in terms of the legacy, there were loads of opportunities for public engagement. Thames 21, London Wildlife Trust were involved from the earliest stages, working with local schools and the scout groups and various other groups that were involved in the park. One of the important legacies has been that there's been a park ranger post which is funded for 3 years, and they're going to be ongoing running activities within the park. A great deal of focus has been put on monitoring. There's this approach known as PRAGMO, Practical River Appraisal, Guidance for Monitoring Outcomes, provided a fantastic framework. It's available on the RRC website. That's some standard guidance that the Environment Agency are very keen to get going on these kind of projects. And also the Urban River Survey was something that I was working on, which looked at the biophysical condition, and it's something we want to get local people involved in. So lots of opportunities to keep engaged and keep monitoring. In terms of value for money, the project has pooled its staff and expertise from many different organisations. They've been able to share the costs and so do more together. They've created this natural floodplain rather than replacing concrete, and thinking about the impacts of future climate change. They basically looked at taking a much more natural approach that focuses on the ecosystem and covers not only the environmental but also the social issues. In terms of economic benefits, payment for ecosystem services was another thing that we were trialling through this urban restoration. The first Urban River Ecosystem Services Assessment was tested out on this project with Dr. Mark Everard, who had been previously involved in the Environment Agency projects in more rural settings. What we found is that you really can demonstrate some uplift in the value of the services provided, and in particular, not surprisingly, cultural benefits, but also regulatory and the supporting benefits. Of course, the proviso is attached to ecosystem services assessment. It's not a perfect science at the moment. It's a method in development, and lots of research gaps were highlighted through that process. In the end, the project managed to demonstrate an estimated benefit for £7 for every one spent, which is a pretty good uplift, I think. Again, focusing on the value to community, areas of health, recreation, tourism, but also conservation and flood risk and lots of other issues. Overall, it represents pretty good value for money, according to Richard Benyon. He's happy, and that's what we like. So let's hope DEFRA are going to commission more of these studies. If you want to go and look it up, it is available via the Environment Agency website. In terms of the future of these kind of projects, I hope there are lots of opportunities. Yes, we can demonstrate that retrofitting is effective in a park situation. As you say, it's an easy win, but there's a lot to gain. Monitoring is, of course, vitally important for all these different elements, and building evidence so that we can continue to support more of these kinds of projects. Thank you very much indeed.